Okay, thank you. Good. All right. Good evening, everybody. I hope you all found a place to park. It is a challenge, so I'm trying to train people to come a little early so that you can beat out the other people trying to park. But I want to remind you that the Barnstable House, which is that way, also has a very big parking lot. It's a little bit farther to walk, but it's good for you. So I hope you next week can find a parking place as well. So thank you for coming out. Next week we will welcome the pastor of the First Congregational Church of Yarmouth, who will talk about his father, who was an associate of crime syndicate boss Mickey Cohen. He will describe his father's life inside the world of organized crime and the dramatic transformation that took place as the result of him attending Billy Graham meetings. So I think that's going to be quite an interesting and perhaps even inspiring talk. Tonight, thanks to our wonderful sponsors, Karen Ronaldo and Kevin Doyle. Thank you. We are very pleased to welcome an old friend of Tales of Cape Cod, Jim Coogan, who is the author and the star. He's looking at me like, what? Of the Body of the People presentations that we offer the Barnstable fifth grade students every year. So he's and he is also a former member of the Tales of Cape Cod board, which makes him an even more special person. So Jim Coogan, a Sandwich resident, is a former columnist for the Cape Cod Times, as well as the Sandwich Enterprise. He is the author of several books, singularly and in collaboration with Jack Sheedy. Tonight, he will talk about Cape Cod Women in the Age of Sail. The book based on this subject received the Forward Magazine 2007 Book of the Year Award. So I'm very, very pleased and honored to welcome Jim Coogan.
Well, thank you, Ann. And I'm glad that you did not introduce me as someone who was an expert on women. My wife was going to come tonight, and she told me, she said, don't get into that, because that's not my forte. Anyway, I'm glad to be here. What a beautiful Cape Cod day. When I was driving over here from Sandwich and I looked at the marsh just beginning to shift to that golden color, we know how lucky we are to be here, and this is just a perfect day. Yes, I have a fairly long association with the Tales. Oh gosh, I don't know how many years ago it was. For a while, there was a poster over on that side of the wall that was from 1974, and it announced 6 speakers that were here for the programs that year, and I was one of them. And at that time, I was 30 years old. Now, this is 51 years since then, and I can't remember what that first topic was, but I've spoken here quite a few times, and I've always enjoyed being here. This is a wonderful venue, and I really should give, and we all should give kudos to the current board, the people in the last few years that have really, the programs that you have throughout, from early May all the way through the fall, it's just incredible what's been done. The building itself, I consider it's a renaissance, that just the things have been done structurally. Again, real kudos to the current board and the people who are operating the whole place. I started working with Lou Cataldo, so, you can know how far back that goes. And all the years that I have come here, I've always enjoyed seeing people that I haven't seen for quite a while, and it's nice, and I've seen a couple tonight, and that's nice. I grew up in Brewster, and I always liked history, and I listened to all the stories of the old timers. I was talking to somebody today that went to the Brewster store. I still call it Donald Doan's because Don ran the place when I was a kid. And, he had the Cracker Barrel and the wood stove, and a lot of the old folks were in there telling a lot of stories. And I listened to them, and I always liked local history. I became a teacher. I taught for almost 30 years at Dennis Yarmouth High School as a history teacher, and I always liked local history. And I think when I became I started to write, I wanted to concentrate on the Cape, and that's what I've done. And I have written 13 books at this point, and in the fall, actually later on this fall, Jack Sheedy and I, my co-writer, we're going to come out with our 6th book together. It'll commemorate 30 years of our writing together, so you can look forward to that probably in November, early December. This book that I wrote about seagoing ladies was kind of a surprise. It wasn't my first book, but being from Brewster, I always knew that the town was the sea captain town. And so when I wanted to look at local history and write about it, I thought, well, what better to write about but the sea captains? There were, at one time, I think over 125 master mariners in Brewster. This would be in the 1840s and 50s. And that was a town with a population of only maybe 900 people. And so I felt that was a great topic. And so I started digging through records and went to museums. And I kept finding references to women aboard ship. And it really surprised me because I had a 26-year career with the Navy, both active and reserve. And at that time, certainly when I was there during the Vietnam War, we didn't have any women on board. And it seemed like an odd concept for me to find that in the previous century, the 19th century, there were women aboard ship. So I was puzzled by it, but I kept coming across references. And then at one point, I went to the library and I picked up a book. And it really hit home to me. It's called Petticoat Whalers. And it's written by a New Zealand writer whose name is Joan Druitt. It was written in 1991. And I would say this became my inspiration for looking at the role of women at sea with their sea captain husbands. This particular book that she wrote about was about the whaling wives. She also had a second book, which came out later, which talked about the lives and experience of women aboard merchant ships. And as I'll tell you tonight, there was quite a difference in the experience of whaling wives versus the merchant wives. It's an interesting title. It's called Hen Frigates, and it comes from the fact that men being so superstitious, if there was a woman on board, they would call the ship a hen frigate. And so that's a kind of a term of derision, but she used it in the title. So I would consider something that, she was kind of a mentor to me, even though we haven't met, but we did correspond on a couple of things, and she was very helpful to me in just kind of getting, the sense of what the life experience was for these seagoing women. So when I came out with the book in 2003, I kept it with the concentration on Cape Cod. As I said, my interest is local history. So I picked a dozen women who went to sea between 1840 and about 1890 that were from various Cape Cod towns. I tried to get one from every one of the 15 towns, but I wasn't successful, so there is a dozen. The book, I often refer to as my only serious book because I've written a lot of books, but this is one that has footnotes in it. So, from a historical point, you really have to be a purist of that. I think over the years I've become more of a storyteller than I am of a pure historian. I think of the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And there was a question that the fellow that ran the newspaper, the Shinbone Star, they asked him, well, if you have a story and you have some of the story and you're not sure of the truth of it, but you have the legend, which do you print? And he said right away, print the legend. And to me, that kind of explains my feeling about Cape Cod history. I certainly try to keep to the facts, but I think the myth and lore of some of the stories on Cape Cod are just as good as the pure history, and certainly they're more entertaining. So the only problem is, as I get older, I keep thinking of what the late comedian George Burns once said, and he was quoted as saying, you know, when you reach 80, you pretty much know everything there is to know. The problem is remembering much of it. So, you know, I've had to be very careful as I've kind of go through my stories that I either get the names and the dates and the towns correct. But again, my incentive for looking into the unusual history of women, I say unusual because when we think of maritime history, it's a male-dominated genre. And, you know, the classic books, 2 Years Before the Mast, Moby Dick, they don't mention any women, and certainly the idea of a woman at sea was unusual. And you wonder, who were these women? And I've looked at photographs from old archives of these women, and I look at their eyes, and from the photograph, as they look back at me, I can tell they are women of strong character, and women who were really willing to, you know, put it on the line. Not so much because they were proto-feminists, that they wanted to break new ground, but because they wanted to maintain a marriage. Good example that I have here is a woman from Stonington, Connecticut. Her name was Mary Brewster. She kept a very good journal of her voyage, but she was married in Stonington, Connecticut at age 18. And her husband, Stephen, shipped out on a 2-year voyage within 2 weeks of the marriage. Then he came home. He was home for 2 months, and he was off again for almost 21 more months. And in the first 5 years of Mary Brewster's marriage, she'd only really had his company for 5 months. So when it came time for him to make the next voyage, she said, I'm going to go. And that's the story of many of the women who went to sea, and maybe most of them, because they were conventional women in the 19th century mode. And when we look at the 19th century, I think sometimes it's hard for us in our own time to realize just how strict the gender roles were. And there was a definite direction for the men and a definite direction for the women. And I think it's hard for us to kind of have that idea of just how strict those roles were. And for a woman to break kind of tradition and go with her husband was quite a challenge. Now, the first woman that I've come across, and I think she's generally given credit, was a Nantucket wife, and she was the wife of a whaler. Her name was Mary Russell. And in the late 18th century, early 19th century, the Atlantic whale grounds, which had been really where everyone from the East Coast was catching whales, became oversaturated, overfished, and then they began to discover the Pacific whaling grounds. Now, with the Atlantic whalers, they might have been gone for 3 months, 6 months at the most. But with the Pacific whale grounds opening up, those voyages would go from 3 to 5 years. So for a woman who wanted to maintain domesticity as they wanted to have it, they didn't have much choice, although they were torn, because going to sea had great hazards. Obviously, you're going in a small vessel. There are storms, there are wrecks, there are pirates, all kinds of things that you had to encounter. And for these women to do that, it was a great challenge. And plus, some of them had children at home, and they left maybe young children that were 2 and 3 years old at home with maybe a relative. So they were going after to try to be with their husband, but at the same time they had this sadness of leaving their small ones. And on whale ships in particular, they were very isolated. If you've ever been to Mystic Seaport and seen the Charles W. Morgan, it's a small vessel. You got about 105, 110-foot vessel. You got a 30-foot beam. You got 30 sailors, plus maybe 2 or 3 mates, and a woman, one of one, whose quarter was in the captain's cabin, which was 8 feet by 10 feet. And she was not allowed to go forward of the mainmast because that was the cruise area. The forecastle is where they lived. So when you think about her restrictions of where she was on that vessel, which might be at sea for months and months before they saw another woman or went to a home port or any port, very, very restrictive and isolated. I think for me, and when I think of that kind of isolation, I would think it would, bring on a lot of depression because the women certainly missed the comradeship of other women, particularly on Sundays. Sundays was the only day of the week when they really had a break from the household routine. And when they went to church, which they all did, this was a time in the afternoon when they could get together. And they missed that terribly. And I've seen that in the letters and the things that they left behind, indicating just how much they missed the companionship of other women on Sundays. Another factor that was a problem for them is many of them were very religious women, and they were on board a ship that had very questionable quality crew. Whale ships very often had to Shanghai someone to go aboard, and there were people that were running from the law. There were people that wanted to escape other responsibilities. They weren't really the most respectable people on board a whale ship. Whaling was a tough business. I mean, essentially you were aboard a floating slaughterhouse, because that's what it was. And imagine trying to keep clean in an atmosphere of such a small, contained area, plus without any women to maybe share that experience with. In doing the research that I did, I spent a lot of time at different museums, and I was lucky enough in 1996 I got a fellowship from one of the historical societies to study a couple of the journals in Provincetown. I actually spent that whole summer going through at the Heritage Museum, and that kind of got me a good start on the women that I wanted to profile. I also spent time, obviously, at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Their archives were really terrific. And then the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem was another good source. The Providence Public Library, that was another source for journals and diaries that have been kept, and fortunately they were saved. I mean, when you think about what could have happened to so many of them, there were 2 kinds of sources that I found that women would write. One was the travel diary, and that was an open letter that was meant to be read by people. Essentially, it was a sort of a continuous postcard of where these women were. And they are helpful because they kind of give the daily routine of life aboard ship, where they may have called as a port call, how many whales they may have taken. It's fairly general. And there were a lot of those around. They was folded up and sent as letters back home so that people would know what was going on. And that brings up a point of how would you communicate in that period? We're talking before the Civil War. If a ship was in Hawaii, for example, it was headed back to New Bedford, other whalers that were in the Pacific would give letters to the ship that was coming back to the States. And so those letters would come that way. There were several islands out there where you could deposit letters, and visiting ships that were from your area would pick them up and they would get them back. But it might be a 2 or 3 month before you would get the connection made on these letters. So that was a difficult thing for the women that were out of communication with their families, and in some cases with their small children. But they did that quite frequently, and those letters are fairly well available. The other one, and those were what we call public journals. The other one, which is more difficult to find, is called a Journal of Conscience. Now these, in the 19th century, again, as I say, the roles of men and women very well defined, and one of the requirements, I guess you'd say, is that a woman in the 19th century should keep a daily journal. And that daily journal was a personal reflective account not intended to be read by other people. It was a journal of conscience, and as people said, essentially it was a talk with God. And these special journals, again, not to be read, were considered to be a way of releasing their tensions and pressures as they tried to survive in a male environment. Those are much more rare to find because they weren't meant to be read, and in many cases they were destroyed. Sometimes you get lucky and someone kept one in a trunk, and then relatives later or descendants found it. Those are very revealing because they tell really how a woman really felt, where she might not be able to say to her husband that she really hated the voyage or that she didn't want to come, because by the 1850s it was pretty much an obligation for the wife of the sea captain to come. And I make the point that it was only the wife of the captain. The mates and the crew were not allowed to bring their women aboard, their mates aboard. But the wife of the captain, by the 1850s, it was obligatory socially that they should go. And some of them went willingly, but a lot of them did not go willingly. I have a poem or a little piece that kind of reveals what they felt. Let's see if I can find it here. The woman wrote in her journal, which I don't think she wanted her husband to find, "When on the seas my days are spent in anxious fears, oft discontent. No social circle here is found. Few friends to virtue here abound. I long for home, sweet home denied, for those I love near by my side." I mean, that's a fairly tame one. I have seen where, some of the women were angry with their husbands. Maybe the husband had too strong a lash for some of the crew members. And that does bring up a point where some of the crew members were quite appreciative of having the captain's wife aboard, especially if they were teenagers. Some of them felt that the captain's wife was like a surrogate mother. And in some ways, I've seen examples where she might have lightened the blow of so many lashes for some kind of transgression. And I remember one quote I read in the New Bedford archives, and it was from a crew member, and he said he didn't like the captain. And he said, "We would have just as soon killed the captain as we would a kitten, but we didn't want to hurt the old lady." Now, there's a case there, if you read between the lines, that maybe the presence of that particular captain's wife was good for the captain and the crew. On the other hand, there was a lot of, I wouldn't call it anger, but there was discontent among some of the mates when the woman came aboard, because in the structure of how the ship should be governed, the captain was at the top of the pyramid, and a first, second, maybe a third mate below them, and then the crew at the widest part at the bottom. Well, where was the woman going to insert herself? If she got too close to the captain near the top of the pyramid, then she was going to have a negative on the mates who didn't like it. So she had to be very careful. And again, we're talking the whale ships where the woman was one of one. It was a difficult position. When they were at sea, sometimes it might be weeks, months before a woman saw another woman. But if another ship came by that had a flag up that a woman was on board, maybe the wife of that captain, they would have what they call a gam. And in that case, the two ships would sail in parallel, and the woman would be lowered in what's called a gamming chair, which is nothing more than a giant barrel that was cut down, and she would sit on a seat, and she'd be hoisted across on open water on a cable, and then she would be able to stay with that other woman for 5 or 6 hours, which was a great pleasure for them. But I don't know about you, but I'm not really keen on over open water being hoisted across to a cable, even if it was to see you, Arthur. I wouldn't do it. But that was very important to them. I give you the example of a woman she was from Sandwich, actually. Her name was Mary Chipman, and she married a West Falmouth whaler. It was Samuel Lawrence. The Lawrence family in Falmouth is, they've got a long imprint in that town, and Samuel Lawrence was one of 4 brothers, all of them whalers out of West Falmouth. And Mary Chipman had been married to Samuel for 7 years, but hadn't gone on any voyages with him. In 1856, he became the master of the ship Addison out of New Bedford, and she agreed to go with him. Now, she had the benefit of having her 6-year-old daughter with her, little Minnie, so she had someone that she could talk to and interact with. The voyage left New Bedford in February of 1856 and sailed around Cape Horn out to the Pacific. And that first 7 or 8 months, they were whaling in the area of New Zealand before they went to Hawaii. Didn't take many whales, but in her journal, which is one of the best journals kept that I've ever seen, she was a wonderful daily chronicler of the activities. She mentioned seasickness, and what they said was paying old Neptune if you got sick. And the food was terrible. You have to imagine, they took all the stuff aboard that was probably rancid at the beginning. By the time they were 7 or 8 months out, it was pretty bad. And she went through about 4 different cooks before she finally settled on one that she felt she could train. But even then, the food was very, very common and not very engaging. And they were sick very often from the food. But then they got to Hawaii, where she was able to get off and meet a number of other whaling wives in Honolulu and Maui. I read a statistic that by 1850, 1 in every 6 whaling ships in the Pacific had a woman on board, and most of them were from New England. It's not to say that there weren't any from Maine, because there were. And the geography was from, Maine all the way down to Long Island, Sag Island and Orient at Long Island. But the vast majority of whalers were out of Nantucket or New Bedford. If you know the story, Nantucket was first, and they had really the monopoly on the enterprise until their harbor became too small for some of the larger ships by about 1850, and then the business changed and went to New Bedford. But those 2 places, and Provincetown too, I would say that you want to include them as a whaling port. About 20 whalers were working out of Provincetown after 1860, 1870, and a lot of women went to sea from Provincetown. But anyway, after that first year, the Addison went up to the Bering Sea, because in the summer they could whale in the north latitudes. And most of the whalers left their wives in Honolulu, but Mary Lawrence decided to go with her husband, and she had Minnie aboard. And they whaled up there, not too successfully. One of the things that Mary wanted to do was to curb the bad language of the sailors. She also wanted them to spend more time reading the Bible, and she couldn't get much success. And one of the things she figured on, and it was a good track, I think, she had her daughter Minnie take her doll carriage and go up into the area where the crew lived, the forecastle. Now, she couldn't go herself because she couldn't go forward of the mainmast, but the little girl could. And the crew dutifully took the Bibles from little Minnie. So in that sense, she thought she was evangelizing the crew. But then, of course, when they got back to Hawaii, all of the Bibles must have been burned, because she complained bitterly about how terrible the behavior of the sailors were on the islands. At any rate, they went south again to New Zealand and then over to Baja, California. Again, she had the chance to have gams with several women from this area. And with little Minnie, she had a companion. They read and they sewed together. She was quite comfortable with having Minnie. When they returned to Honolulu in 1858, the New Bedford papers had just arrived, and she learned for the first time that her father had died. And it was a great shock, because when she'd left, he'd been healthy, and she mentioned in her journal several times about looking forward to reuniting with her mother and father, particularly her father, and she was really hurt by that. And it does show you that the lack of communication instantly at that time, she was in for bad news that had happened probably 2 or 3 months earlier. Well, at the end of the voyage, the Addison did pretty well in the last year. They came back to New Bedford with 2,000 barrels of oil and a lot of bone. A lot of times we think they only went after the oil, but the bone was the plastic of the 19th century. It could be made into many things. So the captain had a good lay, as they called it. He took out about $3,500 from the proceeds of the sale of all the whale oil and bone, which was a good sum at that point. That was her last voyage. She decided that she wouldn't go. He went again, and eventually his ship was wrecked. He was not lost, but when he came back about 5 years later to Falmouth, that was his last voyage. But, her experiences aboard that small, relatively small ship were illustrative of what all of these whaling wives had to go through. They did land on a few tropical islands, which were always dangerous because you never knew if the natives were going to welcome you or not. We have the story in Falmouth of Silas Jones, who was aboard a whale ship, the Awashonks, and his ship was overtaken by natives. The captain was killed, and he was a third mate, and he was lucky enough to survive, and they fought the natives off, and he came back as the captain of the ship because the captain, first and second mate, were killed by natives. So that was always a worry. Shipwreck on Mary Lawrence's ship, they hit an iceberg in the Bering Sea, and the ship it took on a lot of water. They were able to plug it with mattresses, and then they got back to Hawaii, and they were able to make repairs. But one of the things I thought about when I read her journal, you wonder, like, in that situation, would the woman lose her femininity? If she's out there and it's dirty and all these men are there. But I think Mary Lawrence proved to me that she did not. Because when she got back to New Bedford in 1860, she hadn't seen her family in 4 years. And they were waiting in New Bedford at one of the hotels, and she realized at that point that the style of clothing had changed dramatically in the 4 years that she'd left, and she didn't have the proper clothing. So she waited until dark, and then a small vessel took her to one of New Bedford's better clothiers. She was outfitted properly, and only then, as a lady, did she receive and entertain her family that she hadn't had. So that kind of gives you a story of one of the women who went with their husbands. Now, I said, these women who went with their husband were not proto-feminists. They weren't going to break ground. The women that actually stayed home, I think if you look at their history, you find that they were much more progressive than the women who went to sea. And a description of the women who stayed at home from one of the contemporary writers said, "As the sea voyages were very long, the whaling wives left ashore are necessarily obliged to transact business, to settle accounts, and to rule and provide for their families. These circumstances, often being repeated, gave women the abilities as well as a taste of the kind of superintendency to which, by their prudence and good management, they seem in general to be very equal. This employment ripens their judgment and entitles them to a rank superior to that of other wives." So if we're looking at any kind of out-of-the-role model that we would see from women in the 19th century, you're going to see it from the women who stayed home. And in Nantucket, they had a row of shops that were run by women called Petticoat Row. And they ran businesses. They sold clothing. Some of them became school teachers to earn their own money. They took in boarders if their house was big enough. So they had some independence, which was sometimes hard for a man coming back from sea to recognize and accept. I can personally tell you that after 8 months at sea on an aircraft carrier, when I came back, my wife wouldn't give me the checkbook back. And I was not happy about that, but then I had to realize that, she managed with 2 kids at home while I was away. So, we did make a solution to that. For these women that stayed home, again, their independence shows, and there was a song, and again, I think it originated in Nantucket because it's called the Nantucket Girls Song. And here's the song, and I'll say it rather than sing it. I have made up my mind now to be a sailor's wife, to have a purse full of money and a very easy life. For a clever sailor husband is so seldom at his home that his wife can spend the dollars with a will that's all her own. So I'll haste to be wed a sailor and send him off to sea, for a life of independence is the pleasant life for me. But every now and then I should like to see his face, for it's always seemed to me to be a very handsome, manly grace. With his brow so nobly open and his dark and kindly eye, oh my heart beats fondly toward him whenever he is nigh. But when he says, goodbye, my love, I'm off across the sea, first I cry for his departure, then laugh because I'm free. Yet I'll welcome him most gladly whenever he returns and share with him so cheerfully all the money that he earns. For he's a loving husband, though he leads a roving life. And well, I know how good it is to be a sailor's wife. So, this idea, I also think that if you think of Nantucket and New Bedford, they were Quaker towns. And I think the whole philosophy of Quakerism does breed an equality of some sort, at least spiritual equality. And I think in reading about these women, the Quaker women, they picked up the Quaker values of self-control, sobriety, self-reliance, discipline, and thrift. And again, that spiritual equality of believers, which I think gave the women a sense of authority and their own self-reliance. Now, that may be stretching it because obviously women from Maine and women from Long Island may not have been Quakers. They had their own reasons and feelings, but I think that it explains a lot of why the women in our immediate area were able to do what they did. Again, I mentioned aboard the whale ship that the privacy was very, very little. The captain's cabin, as I said, was 6 by 10 feet. The first and second, maybe a third mate, were in the adjacent passageway on both sides, very close to the captain's cabin. So, she really had a very difficult time. The small room had a small toilet and a little wash basin that she could use. But other than that, she really spent her days in isolation for the most part and in lack of a lot of privacy. Another example of a whaling wife that I can give you is Hannah Rebecca Burgess. She's Sandwich's famous woman. Actually, when I'm thinking about that, her ship was a clipper ship and not a whaler. But when she went with her husband, Captain William Burgess, she learned navigation. She had been a school teacher. Now, I find that a lot of the women who went with their husbands, they learned to navigate. He would take the time and they would shoot the stars or the sun in the morning and then at noontime and then the stars at night. So they learned their position. In the case of Hannah Burgess, she made the first trip out to the Far East in a clipper ship, and she enjoyed the trip. And then coming back, he got command of another ship, the Challenger, which was a clipper. And when they were going around Cape Horn on that second voyage, he became very ill and unable to command the ship. Now, Hannah Burgess, she knew navigation, and the first mate was not real sure of his figures, and she essentially took over the navigation of the vessel in her husband's incapacity and skippered the vessel to one of the Chilean ports, about a 600-mile run. So she's quite celebrated in Sandwich as really being, sort of the female captain of that ship. I pass by her grave in the mornings at the Sagamore Cemetery, and I kind of salute her as I'm headed to Market Basket. The other thing about, I mentioned the difficulty of, storms and everything. A lot of women, they had their small children with them. Some of them actually had children at sea. And that, of course, presented its own problems. The captain was probably going to be the attendant for the birth. There was a story out of Provincetown that this woman was her first child, and it was a long labor. Things were not going well, and the captain, who was going to be the midwife, he did the best he could, but he went up on deck and he looked to the heavens and he said, "Dear God," he said, if you just help me get through this, I will name the child after the first bird that flies across the deck. Well, the next morning the child was born, a little girl, and when you know that an albatross flew across the deck, and for that time ever, she was named Trossie Bangs. Now, there was tragedy and triumph, I guess, the successful birth, but I have been in a small cemetery in Pocasset, and there's a little headstone there. I actually made a rubbing of it. It's only about as big as this, but it's a headstone for little Eddie Burgess. Eddie Burgess didn't last long. He was born off the coast of Chile, and he lived for about 2 months. He was the son of Nathaniel Burgess and his wife Ann Cammett Burgess. And he died off the coast of Chile, and they did not want to drop him over the side, so they put him in a barrel with alcohol and brought his body back. And he's buried next to Nathaniel and Ann in the Pocasset Cemetery. Now, these stories are not unusual. Very often, the children were born prematurely, they were underweight, the wife didn't have enough milk. A lot of these children didn't make it. Even more tragic, and I've seen some examples of this, where a child would fall overboard. They generally were, the boys particularly were, by the time they were 5 or 6 years old, they were climbing the rigging and everything, but some of these small children, they were supposed to be on the after deck house with the woman, and she turned her head and the little one went over the side when the ship heeled over. And you read some very tragic stories about that. And then, of course, sometimes the wife died at sea. There was a Brewster captain, Captain Sears, I think his name was Elkanah Sears, and he married a young woman from Orleans, Bethia Knowles, and took her aboard his ship. And there was a honeymoon trip. They sailed from Boston, and they were bound out to the Pacific ports. And she had a great time. The trip around South America was fine. She mentioned in her journal about having pieces of their wedding cake about a month or 2 after they'd left. I don't know how they preserved it, but she had it then. And she talked about how comfortable she was. And they got around to the Pacific, and they went to India, Rangoon, I think, in one of the ports in India. And she described the burning of the bodies there, and how it was really not the place she wanted to stay. But when she was there, she must have caught cholera. And she became very sickly as the ship traveled toward the Cape of Good Hope. And she made entries in her journal, and I saw this journal at the museum in Salem, the Peabody, And her handwriting was very good. By the way, these women in the 19th century were very literate, surprisingly so. The men, not so. Men were terrible spellers. But the women were literate and they wrote well. And she wrote daily about being sick and she couldn't seem to shake it. It was getting worse. And at one point there was a break and the next handwriting was the captain, Captain Sears. And he talked about how she died in his arms and how she was so popular with the crew that they were in tears, he said, and they had her body in the after cabin and the crew drooped by to say goodbye to her. They did bring her back to, she's in the Lowell Road Cemetery in Brewster. But, you know, those kinds of things, they make you think about the challenge that these women faced. It wasn't all roses and companionship. Now, I mentioned the whaling wives, and they're a special group, and I think they deserve special awards, I guess. The wives of merchant sailors, and the captains, much different. First of all, by about 1850, you had a good transatlantic trade going between Europe and America, and the ships were much bigger. We said that the Morgan, the Charles Morgan, was 110 foot long. By the 1850s, you got clipper ships that were running 250 feet long, much more tonnage, much more comfortable. They were still under sail in the 1850s, but a woman who was accompanying her husband aboard a clipper ship had a much different role and a much different life. First of all, the ships were bigger, but she had better accommodations, a bigger stateroom, and because these ships were carrying passengers, paying passengers, the food was much better. So while she would be seasick, she could also have the companionship of other passengers on their voyage. And with a clipper ship and the merchant trade, you knew where you were going. It wasn't a case of, you know, we're going to plow the sea for 6 months looking for whales. If you were going to Liverpool from Boston or New York, you could figure it was going to be a 3-week to a month trip across on a sailing vessel. And you were going to get there, and then you were going to load cargo, but you might have a week where you could travel and visit places. And many of the women here from Cape Cod after 1850 were merchant wives and sailed with their husbands, much more comfortable. And once in port, the woman would have a role of entertaining. She actually was like a hostess for her husband because where the ships were anchored, there were other ships from the United States, many of them from this area. She probably knew some of the people, and they would have dinners together. They would take a hotel on shore so that she had good accommodations there. One woman that I studied was from South Yarmouth. Her name was Rebecca Howes Sears, or Rebecca Howes. And her husband was a Yarmouth captain. His name was Barnabas Howes. And they had a clipper ship called the Swallow. And her journal starts out, he wasn't there, he was in England. And he told her to take the train, which you could do in 1875 she took the voyage, take the train from Yarmouth, make the connection to New York, and then get on a steamboat and go meet me in London, which she did. It was about a 12-day voyage aboard this steam vessel. She met her husband there. Then they boarded the Swallow. Now they sailed first up into Sweden to load cargo up there, and then eventually they went to Cape Town, South Africa, long trip, and then eventually over to Melbourne, Australia. She kept a very good journal, and it's interesting that in one time she said that her husband was very angry about something, the sails weren't set right, and he was quite frustrated. And she wrote in her journal, "I made cookies for Barna, a great baby." You know, I don't know if he was supposed to read that, but she was very personal about her relationships with her husband aboard ship. She went to one of the castles outside of London, and she called it a great pile of rocks. And she, like many of the women, had a very dim view of the natives in places that she visited. I suppose you'd call it jingoism, but it was the attitude of people toward different cultures that they had not encountered before. But somewhere along the line, she became pregnant, and the Captain Barnabas, he didn't want to have her on board, and I guess he didn't want to be the midwife. So they were in Japan, and he said, listen, you got to go home. Your mother's over there, and she'll know what to do. And so he put her on a steamer out of Yokohama, and she took the steamer to San Francisco, across the Pacific. And then she got on a railroad train. Now, remember, the transatlantic line was completed in 1870, so she took the train from San Francisco back to Cape Cod. A month later, she had a little girl. That was her one trip with her husband. It was around the world, and it was the last trip she made. He eventually made several more trips, and interestingly, about 10 years later, he was crossing the street in San Francisco going to pick up his ship, and he was struck by a streetcar, and that was the end of Barnabas House. He's also buried in Dennis on New Boston Road. There's a cemetery over there with him. So the life for the women aboard these merchant ships was much different and much more comfortable. As I said, she was a hostess, and there were breaks in the monotony. They could visit places like Cape Town, London, Liverpool. They could go to Copenhagen. They visited Cape Town, other places in the world, and they kept good journals about it. And in port, again, as I said, she was a hostess. They would rig the ship in the aft deck there. They would put awnings out. They'd have settees. She'd bring out the china, and they would, really entertain, whether it be in Hong Kong or whether it be any of the other ports over there. Now, after the Civil War was a real turning point for maritime enterprises. The whaling industry was already in the decline in the 1860s, but during the war, many whalers out of New Bedford and the other ports on the East Coast were sunk by Confederate raiding ships. So it put a big dent into the New Bedford fleet. And then in the 1870s, 21 New Bedford whalers were frozen in the Bering Sea, and they were lost. And to top it off, oil was discovered in Pennsylvania in this period, and kerosene was distilled, and that became the fluid for lamps as opposed to whale oil. So by the 1870s, really, there wasn't much left of the whaling industry. And although it did continue, the last whaler out of New Bedford was the Wanderer, which went on the rocks on Martha's Vineyard in 1924. And I know that there were whalers out of Provincetown in the teens up until the early 1920s. One of the women who was aboard a whaler had quite a story. Her name was Viola Fish. She was a Barnstable girl, and she married a Provincetown whaler who was a tough guy. And she took the train over to San Francisco and picked him up, and they went not only above Nome, Alaska, but into the Barents Sea. And his idea of catching whales was to stay there for the winter. Now, he was up there with about 5 other whaling ships. They froze in, but they had, wood stoves, and they had plenty of wood from the rivers, and the men kept warm. But, it gets dark in the Arctic, in November, it gets dark, like it's 20 hours of darkness until like March. So she was in there, and she didn't like it. She came back, and this time she encouraged her daughter to go with her. Her daughter was a teenager, and then they went up. They spent another winter. Again, she didn't like it. But then they came back, and they went back for a third time. I don't know why she did this. Her husband was quite demanding, I guess. And so this time, they got frozen in, and they went to come back to San Francisco, and they couldn't get past the ice down by the Bering Strait. They had to stay another winter. Well, she eventually, I would say she went crazy. Clearly it would be depression. And when she came back to Provincetown, she was a shell of a woman. And, the stories I've heard is that she would walk up and down the street talking to herself, and she was clearly off the beam. And two things happened. Well, first of all, her husband divorced her and ran off with a younger woman to Florida, where he started to, he raised oranges down there. They threw him out of the lodge there in Provincetown for doing that. But she eventually died, the poor woman. But Eugene O'Neill was there just about this time. This was around 1900. He showed up in Provincetown in 1915, and he heard about Viola. She was, again, the wife of Captain John Atkins Cook. And he heard about Viola Cook, and he wrote a play, and the play was called Isle, I-L-E. Now, it doesn't refer to an island, but this is what the sailors on whale ship called oil. They called it the Isle. And he had this play about a woman who was going insane in the after cabin, playing her piano over and over and over again. And it was clearly Viola Cook. And it was one of his early plays, and I don't think it got that much publicity, but she became somewhat infamous by way of Eugene O'Neill. So, you know, it was kind of one of those stories, again, of women who had it pretty tough. Again, after the Civil War, you start to go with iron ships, screw propellers, and steam power plants. So, you know, it was much safer. The wives of women who went to sea as late as the 1890s, they were pretty comfortable. And again, you know, there was a threat of having, you know, hit an iceberg or something, and that happened. Some women, you know, were lost at sea, and some of them were rescued. There was a woman from Chatham. Her name was, her husband was Nathaniel Deere. And she was on a ship that they were taking on water off the Chesapeake, about 400 miles off Chesapeake Bay. And the ship was going down, and she got off. And she took the ship's cat with her, and they were in a small boat. They were rolling around on the small boat for about 7 days. They asked her later, why did she take the cat? And she said, well, I thought if we were out there for longer, they'd eat the cat before they'd eat me. And then when she went into Charleston, South Carolina on a rescue ship, and she wrote to her father, and she was so upset about losing the ship, and she said, I had her just all fixed up. I had new Brussels carpet. It was all ready to go, and I did so want to show you when we came back to Boston, but alas, it is not to be. So these kinds of adventures, again, I'd never really come across them when I started looking at the role of sea captains. The final note here is that I've noticed, and I think if you wanted to do a PhD study, this would be a good one. A lot of the women who had their children at sea, and by the way, if a child was born at sea, they would often give him the middle name Woodhull or Seaborn. And so if you look at family records, you're going to see, you know, Annie Woodhull Hassett. That would be that she was born at sea. Sometimes they named them after the place that they were near. So you might see, you know, something from the Canary Islands or something like that as a middle name. But when I think of, you know, the young women, particularly the daughters who were aboard ship, they were really being groomed to become part of that society, which the captains of ship really were at the pinnacle of social and economic society in the mid to late 19th century. They were being bred to marry other captains. And yet, by the 1870s, the age of sail was gone pretty much, with a few exceptions in Maine and maybe on the West Coast, but there were no suitable mates for them to marry. And one of the things I've noticed, I kept a chart of it, of the women that I sort of profiled and looked at who had their daughters who were teenagers in the 1850s, came of age in the 1860s, they never married. And I think, again, this PhD study, if you want to think about it, why didn't they marry? And I can probably supply an answer. These women were well educated. They spoke a foreign language. They had seen the great capitals of the world. And now, what were they looking at for potential husbands? Clam diggers, maybe guys that worked along the shore. There was no suitable match for them. And I think maybe if we'd look into it more, you'd find that that was the case. They didn't marry. And that's an interesting thing. the economy changed by the beginning of the 20th century. Obviously, the country turned inward, where we had been a maritime nation prior to the Civil War and dominated in that period. The decline was rapid. And by the 1880s, the country was looking inward. They were looking to the new frontier. They were looking to exploit the, all of the minerals that were here. And the captains of industry, they became the new economic captains, whereas the ship captains, they were left to tell those stories around the Cracker Barrel and the wood stove. So the story of women at sea is unique. And since I wrote my book, which was in 2003, there have been a number of books. I didn't bring a lot of them. I collect them as I go because I like to see that other writers are taking the topic of women at sea. It's a topic that doesn't get that much publicity, but it should. Because if you're going to look at the history of any place, you want to look at the history of all the people, what they endured, what they contributed, what was their experience. Again, I get back to local history. When I used to teach history, I'd say, George Washington was important, but I want to know what Silam Holt Knowles was doing on his cranberry bog when the call came to fight in the Revolution, or during the Civil War. What about the Quakers of Sandwich? When the draft came in 1863, I want to know what happened to them. It's okay to know about Gettysburg and all that, but I want to know what happened at the local level. And so that's what I think the excitement of looking at a topic like this. You get local women, and again, my book just deals with the Cape Cod women, but you can find studies of the whole industry from Maine, again, to Long Island that you might be interested in going. Well, I'm not sure whether you have any questions, but I know that the dessert waits, and I never like to stand in the middle of that. But if you have questions, certainly go ahead. I think I saw one here.
Yeah, who wrote that song poem and when?
The long poem that I read? It was published in one of the New Bedford newspapers, and all I get with it was called the Nantucket Girls Song. I think you could probably Google it and probably find more information about it. But that's all I have on a reference on that, and I copied it out just today. The Nantucket Girls Song, and it's a long one. Yes? No. That was a man's thing, and that brings me to the idea that, while men might have run to the sea to get away from women, I don't know if that's true, but they always had women on their mind, and they made the scrimshaw, the different types of artwork that they brought home for their women. And before I do that, here's a sea shanty. Short. Farewell and adieu to you fair Spanish ladies. Farewell and adieu to you ladies of Spain. For we've just received orders for to sail back to Boston, and never, my loves, will we see you again. I hope you recognize that from Jaws. All right, I think I saw it, yes. I would think that in the case of the women who were aboard merchant ships, who had time in the major ports, the big cities of Europe, in India, Japan, they certainly must have acquired and learned a lot of things. And in their letters home, they described the things that they saw. So yes, I think their education, and particularly too for the children, they had, maybe 8, 10-year-old kids aboard. Those kids sometimes had tutors. They had a piano usually. They were studying the cultures. They looked down on the cultures that they looked at, but they learned. But for the whaling wives, I don't think so. I don't think they had enough time in places that were inhabited by, let's say, advanced cultures. They probably experienced the natives, but that would be it. Yes?
Is there any record, back in the whaling days, so many ships were lost at sea. Is there any record of how many women were lost on those ships?
Well, it's interesting you ask that. I'm sure that in maritime records, newspapers, you'd be able to find that. But what's interesting when you mention that, this book, Petticoat Whalers, she starts her book talking about bicycling with her husband on one of the islands in the Far East and coming across a cemetery. And there in that cemetery was a headstone of a woman, her name was Sherman, her last name was Sherman, who died aboard a ship, and she was buried on that island. That was the revelation to this author, Joan Druitt, that women had even been at sea. She began to study that. So I think in local histories, I mean, if I were to look at, say, the history of Barnstable, women who went to sea who were lost at sea, I'm sure were mentioned. You had the Barnstable Patriot from 1830. They certainly would have covered it. I think locally they would have. Whether there's a database for that, I doubt. I'm not sure there would be one now. But I bet you could find a lot of them. And there were a lot of them. Yes?
I have two questions in illustrating that is clearly you are a historian at heart, so you can see the big picture. If you want to compare the women during the American Revolution who actually do everything that the men went off to sea to do, but they were all fighting, and when we were talking about and Rosie Riveter in the 20th century, we often hear, maybe because of the 20th century, how difficult it was for the women during the war to go back to their old routines. Can you comment on these other women? Because clearly they were very, very robust. I'm sure these women who came to their own when their husbands were gone off of the whaling ships, but were they able to fall back in line, so to speak?
Well, again, you bring up a point, and I mentioned it with my own experience with my wife trying to get the checkbook back. I think in each case, yeah, it was a difficult adjustment. And again, our gender roles, the way society controls how we interact with each other, it's probably still an issue for people that are in, like, let's take your military today. There are women in the military, and when maybe their husbands are at home, and when they come back, they may expect to come to a role that is not there, or they have difficulty. I bet you that every dislocation like that, whether it be a war or a long voyage, these are common. And I think it depends on the individual on how they accept the changed role or whether they can deal with it. I think it's a kind of a trend through history. And your Rosie the Riveter one is a great one, because when the men came out of World War II, those women, even if they'd had experience out in real life, or I shouldn't say that, but, commercial life, they couldn't do it. And, if you think of a more stifling time, think of the 1950s for women. It wasn't much better than the 1850s.
And secondly, here for Brewster, I was always perplexed, knowing that Brewster is known as a sea captain's where did sea captains find the word?
Brewster, as you know, has no harbor. And that's what makes it very interesting. Well, most of the captains were operating out of Boston, and they would go to Boston to pick up their ships. Even in Seward Harbor, where they built clipper ships, which is right next to Brewster, they didn't sail them out of Seward Harbor. They finished the hull at Seward and then took them to East Boston to rig them, and then they sailed out of Boston. So your sea captains from Brewster, they really operated out of the city. No, it's not true. I mean, Truro at the Pamet River had shipbuilding, and there were a couple of whalers that went out of there, and a couple went out of Orleans too. But Provincetown was the center for whaling on the outer Cape. Truro, Pamet Harbor is really small and always was. So that's not a harbor of opportunity. Provincetown, wonderful, great harbor, and they used it. So, probably. Yeah, well, that's Shebna Rich. He wrote the book in 1888, and he really touted Truro as a great place. It is a great place. Anything else before we... oh, yes. You know, that's something that, sometimes I segue into the modern world, and we should talk about it. I mean, we have women in command of naval ships. We have women at all the academies. I mean, we are in a different era. And yet, again, getting to your point about the difficulty of accepting role changes, there are people that don't want to accept the role changes now. So we live in a changing world, and it's how you accept the changes that, I guess, separates you from those who don't want to do anything new. You've been a great audience. I appreciate it. I don't know. Ann, do you want to lead them to the dessert, or do they go on their own? All right.